She Played the Victim by Paul Martin. Copyright Paul Martin's Fine Films and Audiobooks, 2020. The following story is a work of fiction. Any similarities to persons living or dead is purely coincidental and unintentional. Reader discretion. The story contains some coarse language. Preface. Once upon a time in the not-too-distant past, there lived a little girl. Actually, she was not really a little girl, but loved to identify as such. She was fiercely loyal to those who mattered to her. That is, until they disappointed her, or until she no longer gave a damn about them. Her life was going through a constant cycle that she and those closest to her were oblivious to. They were constantly being caught up in the drama of the now. Chapter 1. The Victim. Phil returned home from his shift working at the construction site. He had had an exhausting day in the heat and needed to wind down. He had been invited to have a few drinks with the workers before driving home inebriated. As he came in through the front door, his new wife Kayla was looking at him intently. Her eyes were watery. She rushed over to Phil and hugged him tightly. Then she started sobbing. "What's wrong, darling?" asked Phil. "It's my friend Ainsley." "Isn't she that girl you're mentoring?" "Yes. She's been rushed into the hospital. She's dying." "Dying? Wow, that's not good," he said slowly. "She's been rushed into hospital so many times, but this time it's serious." After they prayed for her, Kayla logged onto social media. She made friends again with her on-again, off-again frenemy, Selena. Ainsley considered Selena her internet mummy, whatever the hell that even meant. Selena spoke to her over live video. "My baby girl reached this stage because of her lousy, good-for-nothing parents. They're always abusing her. When she had her epileptic seizures 2 nights ago, her father stood over her laughing his head off. Her mum just rolled her eyeballs and continued watching her soap opera. They're bastards. They don't give a shit about her. They're psychopaths without an ounce of empathy." "Yeah, I'd love to beat the shit out of Gary and Lana. Someone should call the police on them," said Kayla, who was shaking with anger. They continued talking all night long. Selena lived in Perth. She suffered from depression and needed people like baby girl to give her life meaning and purpose. Kayla and Phil lived in Melbourne. Baby girl lived all the way up in Cairns. Kayla, Selena and Ainsley had never met each other in the flesh. It had only ever been on social media. The next morning, Phil was making himself breakfast, while Kayla bombarded him with details about Ainsley and how she was in incredible pain, but the callous doctors and nurses didn't give a shit about her. They had done scans and tests on her body and told her she was fine. They had escorted her home in an ambulance, and she had been given a plastic and metal frame around her chest and waist. She looked like a bionic girl with the nuts and bolts sticking out of her frame. She had a look on her face like Joan of Arc, a martyr in armour struggling against the unscrupulous evil masses that were in a conspiracy to destroy her. "We need to go and visit her in the flesh," Kayla finally said. "She means the world to me. I would never forgive myself if I missed the opportunity to see her before she dies." "Yeah, that makes sense. I can probably get a week off work, but without a reliable car that can go long distances, We'll need to take buses. Plane tickets are too expensive at short notice, said Phil. And I also think we should rescue her, ventured Kayla. Selena has disowned her for the umpteenth time. Phil stared at her awkwardly as usual, not guessing her cryptic methods of communication. Finally she filled him in. You know, rescue her, take her back with us, adopt her. Adopt her? She's 19 years old. She's a friggin' adult, for crying out loud. We can't adopt her. He then let out a hearty laugh. Kayla was very angry, and it looked as if a dark cloud had descended over her. Tears started trickling down her face. Phil walked over to give her a hug. I'm sorry, dear. I didn't mean to sound callous. It just sounded kind of corny. Kayla roughly shoved him away. Fuck off, she snapped at him. Phil left for work. Hours later he was back home. Kayla walked out to greet him with a big squeeze hug and a bright smile. I love you, dear, she said to Phil. I love you too, babes, he replied. Ainsley wants to talk to you. Please be nice to her. Ainsley was on live webcam. Phil noticed that the live webcam had been running for the past 8 hours, not long after he had left for work. No wonder none of the dishes or cleaning had been done in the house. Hello, Ainsley. How are you? He asked. I'm in so much pain, she barely managed to say. She was lying on her back in her metallic brace. I love you and Kayla, and I really want to see you both soon. We love you too. We will come up and visit you in Cairns. My parents hate me, and they have disowned me. Phil felt a deep pang of sympathy for her. I'm so sorry to hear that, he replied somberly. They continued talking for almost an hour. Towards the end of it, Ainsley made a proposal. Will you and Kayla be my parents? I'm all alone in the world, and I'm losing the will to live. Phil was like putty in her hands. Of course, he said. Thank you. I love you, Daddy, she said to him. A warm feeling swept over him. He felt an incredible ego boost. Chapter 2. The Visit. Phil and Kayla were being dropped off at the bus depot by Phil's father, Kevin. His father was a kind and soft-spoken gentleman, but cautious and wary. Despite the hot summer and the fact that he was recently retired, he still wore a conservative blue suit and a red tie. I hope you enjoy your holiday in Cairns. There's so many nice places to see and enjoy. The beaches, the Great Barrier Reef, the boat safaris. It's been about 10 years since I saw that awesome place, his father mused. Kayla interjected. We won't have much time for that. We're financially strapped enough as it is. We will not really be able to do much more than visit our friend Ainsley. She needs us. She's being abused by her parents. They hate her. Father looked sad, hearing them talk about this. Then he spoke. If she's being abused, then why hasn't she moved out of home? You said she's 19. Because she suffers from constant seizures. She's incapable of having a job, said Kayla. Don't they have social services for people like her? Asked Father. I don't know. I guess we'll find out, said Phil. And she regards you two as her parents? Asked their father, sounding both low-key and incredulous at the same time. Kayla looked angry and Phil blushed with embarrassment. Sensing the tension in the car, Kevin shrugged. I used to play mummies and daddies when I was a little kid, he thought to himself. Finally, he spoke out loud. "Look, you know I trust you kids and I trust your integrity. I just hope you're not being played by a superficial person. Anyway, I've said enough. I guess this is all very different for me. When I was young, they didn't even have the internet, let alone video chat." Father hugged them goodbye and offered Phil some money, which he reluctantly took. "Get yourself something nice to eat," he told him. They settled into their seats and Kayla turned to her husband. "Don't get me wrong, I love your dad to death. He's the sweetest man in the world, but he should keep his old-fashioned opinions to himself." Phil nodded. "He just doesn't understand our generation or understand the dire straits Ainsley is in." They squeezed their hands tightly together, thinking of their rescue mission to save Ainsley from certain death. The rest of the journey was long and exhausting. They got very little sleep on their bus trips. They spent hours waiting at one station for the next bus to connect them. Without money to relax anywhere, and only the money Father had given for food, they found a cheap fish and chips dinner to keep them going and a public fountain tap to fill their water bottles. They had gone in shirts, t-shirts and sandals, knowing they would be sweaty and probably not get a decent wash in 48 hours. After struggling to stay awake, their next bus finally arrived. After a good long sleep, they had finally arrived in Cairns. They had seen many beautiful tourist attractions along the way, but could not stop and look at most of them. This was, after all, a transport bus rather than a tourist bus. They walked several kilometres across the town from the bus station to their hotel. Unknown to them, they had walked right past Ainsley's house without realising it. Ainsley saw them out of the corner of her eye, but it did not register with her that her friends had passed her by. Besides, she was too busy chatting to other people online to notice. It was 1 p.m, and the hotel generally did not allow customers in until 2 p.m. After the receptionist lady saw how bedraggled they looked, and then smelled their sweaty body odour approaching, she made a quick call to the cleaning staff and informed them their room was ready, encouraging them to take a swim in the hotel pool. An hour later they were basking in the sun after a refreshing shower followed by a swim. By 3 p.m, Kayla phoned Ainsley. Ainsley complained when she found out that they had been in Cairns for several hours but had not bothered to see her yet. Ainsley implied that she was so upset she didn't care if they came to visit her. After repeatedly apologising and giving multiple assurances to Ainsley, she then expressed her desire to have them come over for a visit. As they headed over, Kayla said to her husband, "Be prepared if necessary to fight your way into the house to rescue baby girl." Phil looked at her stunned. "I can't fight someone in their home. That's home invasion and assault. The law would be completely against me." Kayla turned into a rage and stormed off, muttered to herself about how a real man would be ready to go to prison to save a woman's well-being. Phil stood there confused and unable to decide what to do next. He didn't want to accompany her during a domestic argument, much less approach Ainsley's front door. That was beyond cringeworthy. Eventually, Kayla decided to be gracious to her loser of a husband and stopped and faced him with her arms folded, glaring at him. Phil said, "Can we please not have this feud when we're about to meet our friend for the first time? After all, you only ever get one chance to make a first impression." Kayla tossed her head indignantly and continued walking. "Don't worry. I'll be too busy chatting with our daughter, so you might as well get to know the parents. You might even get on with those creeps. Maybe you'll find you've got lots in common with them." Eventually they arrived at her house. It was a pretty basic rundown building, with an upstairs like so many Queensland houses. They knocked on the door. Eventually it opened. A chubby, grey-haired man in his mid-40s opened the door. "Hello there, I'm Phil and this is Kayla. We're friends of your daughter. She asked us to come visit her. Is she in?" "Ah, yes. Good to meet you. I'm Gary," he said warmly. "For a minute I thought you might be Jehovah's Witnesses. Ainsley's been waiting for you all afternoon." Lana, Ainsley's mother, warmly introduced herself. The two couples sat down on the couches. In walked Ainsley. She was hobbling with difficulty in her chest brace, but her eyes lit up. She hugged Phil and Kayla. "Did you fly up here or drive?" asked Gary. "My car is pretty unreliable, so we took the bus," said Phil. "We're staying at a hotel." Gary looked at Ainsley. "Why didn't you tell us you had friends visiting interstate? They could have stayed here." Then looking at the visitors, he added, "But I imagine you've already paid for accommodation." "Yeah, we might as well get our money's worth," said Kayla sheepishly. Ainsley said to Gary, "Daddy, I'd like to spend a couple of hours with my friends. Can you drop us off at the town square to have a look around?" "Sure thing. Hey, what are your plans for dinner?" Phil gulped. Kayla had been pressuring him into taking her and Ainsley out to an expensive restaurant. He wasn't sure how to make ends meet. Before he could answer, Gary interjected, "Hey, why don't you join us for dinner?" Kayla eyeballed Phil, but he avoided eye contact with her and said to Gary, "Sure, if it's no trouble, that is." "No trouble at all." Lana noticed Kayla's agitated expression and said to Gary, "Maybe our visitors already have dinner plans." But Phil said adamantly, "No, we don't. Dinner is fine." "Okay, a barbecue and soft drinks. You're not vegans or anything, are you?" he asked. They shook their heads. He dropped them off. "You're such a cheapskate," said Kayla scornfully to him. Phil ignored the remark, but it stung. He had travelled hours, put a huge dent in his bank account, gotten very little sleep between bus rides, and was now physically and mentally exhausted. After a well-deserved swim that was abruptly cut early, he was finally offered a cheap alternative dinner, and all his wife could do was call him a cheapskate. Yet she had refused to contribute to the holiday, crying poor, and claiming she was bankrupt. He had been too chivalrous to demand she cough up. He felt great stress and tension in his stomach every time he copped her derisive and hateful remarks. The two women chit-chatted constantly while Phil walked a few metres behind them. He saw flying foxes swarming all over the place. The jaded locals couldn't have cared less, but he was overawed at this unique species. He looked out over the large stretches of the beachfront and now regretted only going there for 2 days. He could have been cruising on a boat to the Great Barrier Reef or gone on a crocodile cruise, but instead had travelled to rescue some damsel in distress. She was certainly a damsel, and she was certainly distressed. But was it all in her head? He had his suspicions. As it approached 6:30 p.m, Ainsley phoned her father to pick them up. When they arrived back, they were treated to sausages, burgers, chicken wings, and canned drinks chilled in ice. Over dinner, Gary looked at Phil and saw an uncanny resemblance to his old self of 15 years earlier. He sensed that Phil was looking at him the same way. They were like two peas in a pod. "How old are you?" asked Gary. 30, said Phil. "Oh, to be 30 again," mused Gary. "You're quite young. A lot still to learn and experience." Phil wasn't sure if this off-handed comment was a subtle jab at Ainsley calling Phil her daddy. Was he even aware things could potentially get awkward? But Gary continued. "The way things are portrayed by Ainsley, you would think I'm the bad guy and that she's been badly abused and about to die, always trying to get attention from people, always giving the impression that she's about to die. If I had $1 for every time she's been carried away in a stretcher by the ambulance only to have the doctors later say there's nothing wrong with her, I'd be pretty rich. She constantly complains to people about me, says Lana and I mistreat her. I've told her many times she's free to move out, but she never has. Friends have even offered to let her live with them, but she doesn't want to. That would involve paying rent and contributing to costs. She's too lazy to work, so she busies herself with a full-time job of complaining about life on social media." There was a thoughtful pause. Then eventually Phil said, "Look, we're good friends with your daughter and we're pretty concerned about her health, worried she might die. I mean, she does have epileptic fits, right?" Gary replied. "It's mostly in her head." Phil nodded. Their conversation was interrupted as Ainsley brought her laptop screen over to show the selfie of the three of them that had been taken at the Cairns city centre. Ainsley was taking great delight in sending the picture to Selena, even though she had just burned her bridges with her internet mummy. She had become jealous of the fact that she had not met Ainsley in the flesh, but Phil and Kayla had. Ainsley giggled constantly at the undignified messages made by Selena. Gary did not join in the laughter but looked sad. He spoke. "You shouldn't be mocking Selena or judging her. That's for God to do. Our job is to pray for her." There was an awkward silence and Ainsley walked away with her laptop. They continued talking until late at night. But Phil and Kayla walked in the dark towards their hotel. "What were you and Gary talking about?" she asked him. "I overheard most of it. Sounds like he was telling lots of bullshit about baby girl." Phil avoided answering her accusatory question. "They seem like pretty nice people, friendly, hospitable. Nothing manipulative at all, nothing fake." "What's that supposed to mean?" she snapped at him. "Just that," he replied. "Oh, so you're saying that Ainsley is manipulative and fake?" "I didn't say that, did I? But..." "But?" she asked. "But it seems a bit hard to believe. All the stuff she said about them abusing her and trying to kill her and of callously laughing at her suffering. Besides, everything Gary said rings true, makes sense, both with my gut instinct and sheer logic." "I don't want to know about it," she said, blocking her ears. When they arrived back at the hotel room, Phil hopped into the double bed, but Kayla did not join him. Instead, she got into the single bed and said she had gotten a headache. When asked if she was upset, she simply snapped, "I'm fine." The next morning, they briefly visited Ainsley again and went out to a coffee shop along with her parents. Gary dropped them off at the bus station where they caught the bus home. Upon returning home, after another arduous journey, Phil and Kayla found that Ainsley had blocked them on social media. She had also blocked them from phoning her. Upon stalking Selena's profile, Phil noticed Ainsley was friends with her again. Kayla was distraught for a few days. Phil was enraged that they had wasted time, energy and money on a dreadful holiday for a narcissist. They deleted all photos they'd taken of her and of their visit with her. Chapter 3. The Toxic Dependent. Kayla was now 3 months pregnant, went in and asked Phil, "Do you still have those photos we took with Ainsley when we visited her in Cairns 2 years ago?" No, you strongly insisted I delete and erase all of them. Why do you ask?" "Well, she's friends with me again. She unblocked us on social media, and she's very excited about the pregnancy, and she wants to know if we still have those photos." "You mean to tell me that she also erased the photos of our visit to her, blocked us on social media for 2 years with not so much as a reason or explanation, and now she wants to come back into our lives again and be part of the family?" asked Phil incredulously. "Oh, please. No one's perfect. Besides, it feels great having her back in our lives. Anyway, it's not her fault. She was manipulated by that nasty bitch Selena." "Why has she added you back, but not me then?" asked Phil. "Probably because she thinks you hate her," said Kayla casually. "I don't hate her. I just can't understand how she can love us one day, then hate us the next." But Kayla simply replied, "Just get over yourself and this childish keeping of grudges." And so Kayla and Phil had been manipulated once again into bringing her back into their lives. They even agreed to pretend to be her parents again. They called it mentoring. But Phil had work and cleaning out unused junk in his shed, and time in the evenings watching movies, which left little time for mentoring a 21-year-old woman who still lived with her parents. This time around, Ainsley was complaining about all the shitty and incompetent doctors out there who had so far refused to give her prescriptions, insisting she didn't need them. After about a week, Phil noticed that he had been defriended by Ainsley on social media, but Kayla hadn't. When he asked Ainsley what was going on, Ainsley blocked him. Then Kayla said to Phil that it was his own fault for not spending enough time with baby girl. Kayla was spending 3 to 4 hours a day chatting on webcam, talking with Ainsley and Ainsley's closest friends, a clique of 4 girlfriends. Apparently, she needed a lot of mentoring. As the months went by, so the hours spent mentoring started to increase. Phil decided that if he tried to break up their friendship, it would make them more determined and resist him. He would let her discover this by herself. But instead, he found his wife was spending a minimum of 13 hours a day on her laptop. Finally, he had had enough. He asked his wife to spend less time on the laptop and more time on walks outside, doing housework or outings. Her eyes went wide with panic. Her hands began shaking. "No!" she said almost hysterically. "I need to be spending at least 13 hours a day with her. You can't take me away from these people. They're my real family." Despite her initial defiance, she began spending less time online and began outdoors activities. As this happened, Ainsley blocked her again, once more. Several months later, Kayla gave birth to twins. It was the biggest transition they'd ever gone through in their lives. seeing the little boy and girl exit the womb had an indescribable effect on Phil. He felt like a completely new person. He felt ready to die, having passed on his genes to a new generation. It was like all his ancestors that had lived on in him were now passed on to his little ones. He was finally a real parent, and not a fake parent of a fake person. Phil also noticed a profound change in his own parents, who had now become grandparents. They were so deeply full of love and affection for the babies with a depth he had not seen in their parenting decades earlier. Having children also helped solidify the marriage between Phil and Kayla, and in the years ahead, he was almost certain that if they'd not had children, their marriage would have ended in divorce. Having children made them work on their issues and reconcile their differences. Chapter 4. Harming Oneself. Phil walked his 9-year-old twins from a beautiful weekend at their grandparents'. He knew his kids were closer to his parents than he was, but he was not the least bit jealous. That's the way it's meant to be, he thought with a chuckle to himself. I guess one day I'll have a very deep connection with my future grandchildren. Upon arriving back home, he entered the bedroom. His wife was staring intently at the computer screen. Phil laid next to her to see what was so fascinating. He saw Ainsley on webcam, lying asleep. He stared at Kayla for a while, but she said nothing in response. He finally broke the silence and asked her, "What are you doing?" "I'm watching baby girl. She wanted me to watch over her as she sleeps," said Kayla, not averting her gaze from the screen. "You've got to be kidding me," said Phil. "She needs you to watch her sleep? That's complete bullshit. She's 30 friggin' years old, for hell's sake. And she needs you to watch her sleep? What is she, 2 years old?" "Leave me alone. I'm not doing you any harm with this," said Kayla, sounding deeply hurt. "Don't neglect your own family in the process," said Phil. "She is my family," snapped Kayla, "and I've told the children that they have a big sister." "That is not cool," said Phil. "Once she cuts off from you like she always does, they will be left feeling deeply hurt." "Don't be so cynical and pessimistic," said Kayla. "But she does this same thing with you every 2 or 3 years. She befriends you, she gets really warm and close to you, then you disappoint her, or annoy her, or doubt her tall tales, or don't give her enough attention, so she cuts you dead. Then 2 or so years later, she decides she misses you, befriends you again, goes through the same never-ending cycle. She's toxic. Her friendship is ugly and utterly toxic. What do you actually get out of this so-called friendship? All you get is to waste colossal amounts of time and listen to her complaining all day long about how much pain she is in and why her life is so miserable. It's a sick, never-ending cycle. Mark my words, she will cut off from you again. It's a matter of when, not if." Kayla replied, "She would be happy to be friends with you if only you would stop calling her a liar and accept that she's not imagining it." "But she is a liar. How is it that she goes through multiple hospitals, multiple clinics, and multiple doctors or other health professionals? They all say she's fine." "Because the doctors are all incompetent buffoons," said Kayla. But Phil was undeterred. "Now see, I don't buy that. Every now and again you get a doctor guilty of incompetence and malpractice. But you never get that with all doctors, especially in a well-developed first world country like ours. If 10 doctors say the same thing, I'm going to put my money with the 10 doctors over one individual, especially an individual with a proven track record of dishonesty and attention-seeking behaviour. Kayla was unmoved. Then how do you explain the fact that she fell out of the hospital bed and smashed her head on the cement floor? Phil replied, "How indeed? For starters, she was about to be turned out of the hospital since they ruled there was nothing wrong with her. Secondly, hospitals have very strict and professional standards regarding safety measures and occupational health and safety requirements. So if anyone fell out of a hospital bed, the most likely scenario is that they did it to themselves deliberately." "Okay, I've heard enough of your nasty speculations. This conversation is over," said Kayla, storming away. Undaunted, Phil called out to her. "She's a professional victim. She relishes people giving her attention and making a fuss over her. She harms herself physically and emotionally so she can live off of her pity party." Kayla spun around and glared at him. "You have no idea about all the health problems she has and all the medications she is on and how much our health system has failed her." But Phil simply replied, "Oh, I don't doubt that for a second. That's what happens when you spend years taking prescriptions you don't need, years of ignoring medical advice, years of brooding over real or imagined problems, and years of living a meaningless life. A volatile, chaotic life brings about volatile, chaotic health conditions." Kayla snapped at him. "You're no doctor. You're not qualified to talk about medical problems." Phil nodded. "True, I'm not. But then again, neither is Ainsley, neither are you. But I've done enough research into pseudo-seizures to know that they occur in people who are not epileptic, but have severe psychological problems." Epilogue. Ainsley looked in the mirror. She was weary from couch surfing from house to house and needed a boyfriend so she could have someone to look after her and provide her needs. She didn't really want to return to her parents. She had done that 5 times in the last 4 years since leaving home. She struggled hard to find a good permanent job, especially since she couldn't really commit to the hours of a working stiff. Back when she was 21 years old, she could pass for someone of 13 or 14 years old, and her cute victim act won her loads of sympathy. But now at 30, she no longer looked cute. Her self-inflicted victimhood had aged her prematurely. She had wasted over the first decade of her adult life on meaningless pursuits, and perhaps it was now time to rethink her life and detoxify from social media. She wondered what she had really achieved in the never-ending soap opera that it had been of her life. But it was going to take incredible hard work and discipline in an uncomfortable journey to a more meaningful life. The end.